Welcome back to Antisocial Studies. Over the past few episodes, we've covered Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And we could go through other notable colonies like Maryland, which was founded by Catholics on the premise of religious tolerance. Tolerance toward Catholics, right? But then they lost control of the colony to, you guessed it, Protestants who revoked their act of toleration. Classic. Or we could look into Georgia, James Oglethorpe's prison colony, where he envisioned a new approach to criminal justice, one in which prisoners could work toward release and have a second chance at life in the New World. Well, and also English prisons were getting crowded and they hadn't taken Australia yet, so two birds, one stone. But in all honesty, most Americans don't really need to know the ins and outs of every single colony. What you really need to understand is that each colony was founded independently by different people for different reasons with different goals. The fact that we are going to become united after our common revolution is not a foregone conclusion. We've established that from the beginning of the English founding, the modern United States is weird, disjointed, a lot of different countries in one. But we do have a few through lines that will pop up again and again, and one of the main sources of conflict and division in our country come from race and social class. So let's get into these by looking at another single year in the colonial period, 1676. First up, Bacon's Rebellion. Not that kind of bacon. About 70 years had passed since the first permanent settlers showed up in Jamestown, and the royal colony of Virginia was facing some trouble, including political corruption, economic disparities, and conflict with Native Americans over land. Basically, most of the good arable land had been claimed at that point by wealthy men from England who dominated the colonial government as a new version of Europe's landed aristocracy. Governor William Berkeley's policies favored the wealthy elite and established planters, neglecting the poorer farmers and former indentured servants who were increasingly getting pushed west to less desirable land. Undesirable partly because of the terrain and partly because it was closer to powerful indigenous groups who were actively resisting white expansion into their lands. Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy young planter who felt marginalized by Berkeley's administration, emerged as a leader of these discontented settlers. Their main petition to the Virginia House of Burgesses, Bacon and his followers demanded protection from indigenous attacks and requested permission to retaliate against them. And somewhat surprisingly, Berkeley initially refused to authorize a military campaign against the Native Americans. Now, to be clear, Berkeley was not sympathetic to the indigenous people. This was not an act of tolerance. He just didn't think it was worth the risk to provoke tribes, and he didn't really want to have to pay the expenses associated with defending the disputed border. He thought, the settlers I forced to live out there can kind of do that for me. In response, Bacon and his followers formed their own militia and conducted raids against indigenous villages. Like many rebellions, the initial cause got obscured by a larger movement of people who were just angry at the powers that be for a variety of reasons. Bacon's forces grew, and in September 1676, they turned eastward and captured Jamestown, the capital of Virginia, forcing Governor Berkeley to flee. However, Bacon's rebellion began to unravel after Bacon suddenly died of dysentery in October. Without his leadership, the rebellion lost momentum. Berkeley returned to power briefly, but the rebellion had exposed deep social and political divisions within Virginia society. Bacon's rebellion highlighted the tensions between the wealthy planters and the poorer settlers, as well as the grievances of former indentured servants. It prompted Virginia's elite to adopt policies that favored greater social control and stricter racial divisions to prevent future uprisings. Basically, the wealthy leaders of colonial Virginia recognized that as elites with a limited resource, land, they were always going to be technically outnumbered by the masses. How could they ensure that they would stay in power and another more powerful, popular revolt wouldn't come along to take them down? Allow me to introduce the tried and true tactic of divide the masses and pit them against each other so they forget who the real enemy is. The simplest way to do this in colonial Virginia and across the South as other colonies took notice was to create racial divisions. Basically create what Du Bois would later refer to as a color line that would make it unlikely for poor people to cross and find unity among other ethnic groups in their same economic situation. For one, planters essentially ended the use of indentured servants. Paying for a worker for a few years and then having him leave, become your competition, and have to find a replacement? Yeah, it was maybe more cost-effective up front, but the long-term ramifications made planters much more incentivized to invest in enslaved Africans. It was more costly up front and horrifically costly in terms of, morals, ethics, and the general well-being of humanity. But Virginia planters started to prefer a more rigid class division based on something outwardly apparent that couldn't change: skin color. Slave codes emerged that declared that slavery was exclusively for people of African descent, and that slavery was a condition that was passed down through the generations. Children of enslaved women would automatically become the property of their enslaver, making the upfront investment far more lucrative down the line. The effect of Bacon's rebellion, the fear it instilled in the elites of mass revolt, cannot be overstated. Yes, slavery had already existed in the colonies. It was one of many forms of coerced labor used by landowners. And yes, the enslaved people in the English colonies had already been Black Africans. However, after Bacon's rebellion and the ensuing slave codes, slavery became a permanent status as chattel, economic property, rather than a human working off some real or fictitious debt, and Blackness became intrinsically linked to slavery. Poor whites, even those who started as indentured servants, were immediately moved up the social ladder to be permanently above any and all Black people. This strategy of dividing people who share a similar economic class by using social constructions like race, it's going to be used time and again through U.S. history to great effect, unfortunately. The Virginia government also cracked down on Native Americans along the frontier, implementing more aggressive policies to secure white land and prevent the lower white classes from having another reason to burn the capital to the ground. White men were appeased at the expense of everyone else in Virginia with a darker skin tone. While this was going on in Virginia, a new colony of South Carolina had just been formed. Learning from Virginia, they were the first to entirely rely on enslaved Africans for labor, bypassing indentured servitude completely. By 1715, there were more Black people in South Carolina than white people. It was the only colony in English North America where white settlers were literally outnumbered by enslaved Africans. This, of course, led to its own rebellions and forms of resistance, the largest being the Stono Rebellion of 1739. Led by a literate slave named Jenny, also known as Cato, along with about 20 other enslaved Africans, the rebels raided a store for weapons and ammunition, then marched south towards Florida, a Spanish colony that did not treat slaves like chattel, but as human workers who could marry, own property, and purchase their own freedom. Burning houses and killing white settlers along the way, the rebellion grew until it was suppressed by local militia. Like Bacon's Rebellion, the Stono Rebellion resulted in harsher slave codes in South Carolina, restricting movement, assembly, and education among enslaved people. So, if the main cause of social disruption and hierarchy in the southern colonies was class and eventually race, well, what was going on up in New England? New England's land was not productive enough to ever really warrant a large number of enslaved workers, although port cities boomed as active participants in the slave trade. New England colonies were primarily made up of somewhat homogenous communities of white Protestant Christian families. As we saw in previous videos, the leaders of some of these colonies were far more restrictive in who they allowed to settle there, often vetted and approved by church members. Their biggest obstacle to growth, well, it's those pesky Native Americans who for some reason won't go away and leave them alone. After years of escalating tensions over land, resources, and cultural differences, in 1675, Wampanoag chief Metacom, or King Philip, united various tribes to resist English encroachment. The war saw brutal raids and massacres on both sides, with Native Americans attacking isolated settlements and the English retaliating with overwhelming force. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in American colonial history, resulting in widespread death, destruction of villages, and displacement of indigenous populations. The war ended with Metacom's death in 1676 and the decimation of indigenous resistance in New England. Its aftermath led to harsher treatment of Native Americans, increased colonial expansion, and the loss of native lands and autonomy in the region. Metacom's War is also the earliest example of people from across multiple English colonies uniting to defend against what they perceived as a common threat. Colonists from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Maine, as an extension of Massachusetts somehow, joined together in one of the deadliest wars in American history. Based on the percentage of the existing population who died, it's near the top. So, what have we established so far? Why does this matter? Well, the primary concern in the southern colonies is agricultural production and the preservation of the elites, who have proved effective at using the colonial government new laws to organize society along racial lines that pit potential economic allies against each other. And in the northern colonies, some fledgling unity is forming across various communities who are beginning to define their common identity as Protestant Christians, moving on from fighting so much from within and instead focusing on defending their Christian cities upon the hill from external threats. If you know anything about the American Revolution, you kind of know where I'm going with this. It's no coincidence that New Englanders will often be at the forefront of rebellious activities and urging unity against British oppression, while Southern leaders, especially from Virginia, will play an important military and economic role in the success of the revolution and the preservation of the established socioeconomic system. So let's recap. In the South, the early colonies were founded based on adventure, exploration, land, and wealth. They retained close ties to England out of economic necessity, since England was the only one allowed to buy their cash crops, and they needed the protection of the crown to continue to renew their business charters and protect their land. People in the South also stayed more culturally connected to England. Many of the Southern settlers were Anglican, and since most were young single men, they planned on eventually either moving back to England to marry or bringing an English bride over to America. And this illustrates one version of the American dream: wealth. These Southern colonists were in many ways the original rags to riches story, especially since many of them were prisoners, indentured servants, or just from the lower social classes back home. And it's important to note that this wealth was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, but more on that in future episodes. In New England, we see the earliest colonies founded on the basis of religious zeal and a desire to build a new community that would reflect true Christian values. These settlers were often families. They were fleeing persecution or seeking more religious independence, and so they did not stay as connected to England. Once they got here, very few intended to go back. Their version of the American dream was freedom, but a kind of narrow type of freedom. Freedom to practice their version of Christianity, not just freedom carte blanche for everyone. And New Englanders don't need enslaved labor in the same way that the South thinks they do. Their soil is rocky, farms are small. They didn't have use for enslaved Africans like they did on massive southern plantations. But the New England coastline was perfectly suited for shipping and trade, so they were happy to make money as the middlemen, receiving newly kidnapped Africans and selling them to southern plantation owners for a profit. Over time, the New England economy developed differently. It relied on trade and eventually manufacturing rather than large-scale agriculture. The northern colonies would grow into their role as a center of trade, and they would chafe under the mercantilist policies that required them to only trade with England, much more than the South, who was, in general, kind of happy to have a steady market for their cash crops. Already, we should be noticing two paths, the North and the South, diverging. They're not incompatible. Both want to mostly be left alone to practice their religion or work their land as they see fit. But from the beginning, the culture, ideology, and general founding philosophy of the northern and southern colonies were different. But it's fine. I'm sure that won't cause any problems down the road. And there were those who saw America as a true land of opportunity for all Christians, even for non-Christians, for Native Americans, for women. These voices were in the minority, but they were there. For now, one thing is clear. All of the colonies were founded because the new settlers wanted some form of freedom and independence. Whether it was escaping the rigid class structure of England to find economic opportunity, freedom to practice your form of Christianity without persecution, or true freedom from old world power structures, all early white Americans had that in common. And so even though the colonies were founded for different reasons and developed distinct cultures, they will be able to unite for a while when that liberty and independence from the oppressive forces in England is threatened. Is that George's music I hear? Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Go find me on social media or support me at patreon.com/antisocialstudies.